I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Navdanya. And I just thought it would be nice to revisit the issues we've been raising since Navdanya was established 21 years ago, and connect two issues that normally run in parallel. One, the genetic engineering of our seeds and our crops and our plants, and the other, the emergence of monopolies over seed supply, with patents and intellectual property rights being one element of that monopoly. If one looks back at the history of genetic engineering, the first genetically engineered organism that was then patented and started the slippery slope on patenting of life forms was the bacterium that General Electric got a patent from 1980. Now this happened not through patent offices. It didn't take place through legislation and law writing or Congress in the US. It was a court decision. And this was the famous Chakravarti case, Anand Mohan Chakravarti. The interesting thing is Anand Mohan Chakravarti himself said he'd merely shuffled genes around, he didn't create anything new, whereas a patent is supposed to be given only for genuinely novel creations. But now, since the late 80s, the many debates we've been having, whether it was around the intellectual property regime of WTO, or cases of piracy like the Neem case and the Basmati case and the wheat case, that particular patent is held as a sacred watershed because it begins to define life as manufacture. And the redefinition of life as manufacture is at the heart of genetic engineering. But of course, because genetic engineering evokes instant reaction, they then moved into the language of genetic modification. So we have this totally incongruous description of GMOs, and when you have to describe them, you have to say genetically engineered organisms, and ordinary people say, why is it not GEO? Why is it GMO? And of course, in the treaties and negotiations, they go one step forward and say, no, it's LMO, it's just living modified. And of course, living modified means every offspring is different from the parents. It's similar but different. So in fact, evolution is living modification, therefore genetic engineering is no different. Of course, this is very different when it comes to patenting, where you claim novelty. So there's a schizophrenia of it's novel when it comes to ownership, and it's same as nature when it comes to issues of safety. And that is really at the heart of the contradictions around these issues. Within India, the first genetically engineered organism that was introduced, the GM seed, was the BT cotton, introduced literally illegally in 98, and it was the case that the Research Foundation Navdanya brought to Supreme Court and alerted the country on the fact that there were laws that needed to be obeyed, the environment protection laws, which had created the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee, which is supposed to be the statutory body to look at imports, trials, field trials, releases, and commercialization. The history of the case is very interesting because along the way, the Department of Biotechnology, which is not the statutory body, redefined the language of deliberate release, which means anything brought into the environment, to say large-scale trials will now be treated as contained, and only commercialization will be treated as open. Of course, a trial is not contained because it's interacting with the soil, with the air, with the pollinators. And unfortunately, that very artificial definition was then used to legitimize trials, and trials were used to build up seed stock, and seed stock was then used for commercialization in 2002. 2002 is very interesting because in March of 2002, Monsanto, the company that has bought up most of the seed supply in cotton in this country through licensing arrangements, of intellectual property rights. Monsanto brought evidence, according to them, evidence that there was pirated BT in Gujarat. Now, this was actually not pirated BT. Desai had just done crossbreeding. And yes, there was BT contamination. But the contamination came probably through selections in the areas where these field trials had been happening. 22 places these trials had happened. Poor Desai had to go underground. He was hounded. The environmental ministry went to the courts to say this crop is so dangerous because it has a toxin in it, it will destroy the soil, it will destroy related species, and therefore must be burnt down. That was March of 2002. In April of 2002, Monsanto gets a clearance. Monsanto Mahiko get a clearance to plant BT. And suddenly this was a safe crop. But in the 6 years we have seen it's not safe for farmers. The majority of suicides in this country are in BT areas. In fact, the suicide started in the areas where hybrids were introduced by Mahiko Monsanto, partly because they were prevented from selling the genetically engineered cotton. Now, these correlations are now so clear, you just have to map numbers of suicide per district and BT sales per district, and you get a one-to-one correlation. There's nothing more clear than that. But the fact that the correlation is becoming so established, and in Vidarbha, in fact, there are lots of maps that say where there's BT, there's suicides, as is the case with genetic engineering, and and I'm sure Jeffrey will talk more about this. Immediately, big international institutions are mobilized to generate reports. And the new report that has been generated to say there's no link between suicides and BT cotton is a report from IFPRI, which is a CJIR system-based institution. It's based in Washington. And they put out a fat report like that to make two claims. That in the long term, there's no change in farmers' suicides in India, indicating farmers have always committed suicide. But the suicides are concentrated in the last 10 years, since the seed supply started to get monopolized. 250,000 farm suicides. Now the long term that they adopt is 10 years. They take 10 years and call it long term and say Indian farmers have always committed suicide. There's no change. And then they go on to say, the part that I really love is, they go on to say, and yes, in places where there is a problem, it's not with the technology. They say, the technology represented by the BT trait should not be blamed. Instead, the conditions at which it was introduced, sold and used explain the observed losses in specific regions. And then, of course, the suicides because of the losses. And they go on to talk about how farmers don't have the capacity, the soils are all wrong, climate isn't fit, but the technology is perfect. The interesting thing is, when it comes to failure, the technology is separate from the context. But when it comes to success, then it's part of it all. Then the farmer doesn't get credit. The irrigation doesn't get credit. The soil doesn't get credit. And this is the second schizophrenia. If the first was sameness in safety and novelty in propriety rights, the second is the schizophrenic treatment of technology. When things go wrong, farmers are to be blamed. The society is to be blamed. The ecosystem is to be blamed. Then things go right, then it's us.